The sun rose over Denver International Airport with a calm brilliance that belied the chaos that was about to unfold. Its golden rays glinted off the sleek fuselage of Flight 427, a massive commercial airliner preparing for a routine flight to Chicago. In the midst of the bustling airport, passengers moved with the casual urgency of morning travelers, some sipping coffee, some scrolling through phones, some lost in daydreams of destinations unknown. But in the cockpit, a storm of a very different kind was gathering. Emma Lawson, 17, stood at the threshold of the cockpit door, her eyes wide and heart pounding. She was a high school senior from Aurora, Colorado, known among her friends for a precocious curiosity, an unshakable love for aviation, and a maturity beyond her years. Today, she was living what many pilots could only dream of, sitting in the co-pilot seat of a commercial jet, hands inches from the controls, under the careful supervision of Captain Frank Torres, a man who had spent 3 decades in the skis, flying through storms that made lesser men break into a cold sweat. "Ready for takeoff, Emma?" Frank asked, his gruff voice carrying both warmth and authority. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and deep lines etched around eyes that had seen more miles than most airports had runways. He was relaxed but confident, the kind of man who seemed untouchable when sitting behind the yoke. Emma nodded, a nervous smile spreading across her freckled face. "I've been ready for this my whole life," she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. Her hands, smooth and inexperienced, grazed the edge of the throttle, tracing the contours of a control panel that had always felt like an unattainable dream. She could feel the vibrations of the engines even before the jet began to taxi, a deep, resonant hum that made the floor beneath her seem alive, pulsing with possibility. The plane began to roll slowly along the taxiway, the tires humming against the concrete. Outside the cockpit windows, the world blurred, a mix of airport vehicles, other planes, and the occasional security officer waving impatiently. Emma's stomach flipped with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She could barely believe she was here. She was supposed to be a student, a teenager worrying about exams and college applications, not piloting a commercial jet. And yet here she was, feet planted on the same metal floor that thousands of pilots had trusted with lives. Frank's voice cut through the roar of the engines. "All systems normal. Autopilot is functional. You'll see, Emma, flying isn't just about hands on the yoke. It's about presence, focus, calm." Emma nodded again, inhaling sharply. She had watched countless flight videos, memorized manuals, and practiced in simulators, but nothing in her life could replicate the gravity of this moment. The plane lurched gently as it lined up on runway 27, a subtle vibration reverberated through the cabin, the kind that hinted at the incredible force coiled within the engines. "Here we go," Frank murmured, gripping the controls with a practiced ease. "Throttle up, let's lift off." The jet surged forward with a force that pressed Emma back into her seat. Her ears popped as the speed climbed, the ground falling away beneath them. She could see the airport shrink in the distance, the cars and tarmac blending into a patchwork of gray and green. Her stomach danced with a strange mix of fear and wonder, and for a brief moment she felt as if she were floating, not just in the air, but in a place outside of time, suspended between childhood and adulthood, between ordinary life and something extraordinary. And then it happened. A sharp, unnatural thump echoed through the cockpit. Emma's heart skipped a beat, her stomach dropping as she turned toward Frank. He had slumped forward over the controls, his body rigid for a moment, then sagging completely, his face pale and eyes closed. "Captain?" Emma's voice cracked through the headset, trembling. She reached out, shaking his shoulder lightly, but there was no response. The intercom squawked behind her, the voice of the first officer, a young man named Derek cutting through the tension. "Tower, we've got a problem. Captain Torres is unresponsive. Requesting emergency guidance, control is compromised." His voice was tight, urgent, betraying a fear he tried to mask. Emma froze. Her mind raced, a torrent of thoughts colliding at impossible speed. She had never imagined a real emergency, never imagined a scenario where she would be responsible for the lives of 300 people, some of whom were families, some of whom were children clutching stuffed animals, others engrossed in books or tablets. And now the unthinkable was happening. Her hands trembled as she instinctively reached for the yoke. It was heavier than she expected, the metal cold under her fingers. She glanced at the instrument panel, her eyes scanning for the autopilot button, the altitude indicators, the throttle controls. She remembered Frank's words, his calm reassurance, presence, focus, calm. But right now, she felt anything but calm. Outside the cockpit, passengers were settling into the rhythm of flight. Children laughed, coffee cups rattled in their holders, and a few passengers stretched, yawning against the monotony of travel. No one yet knew that a disaster was a heartbeat away. Emma's hands hovered over the controls. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Okay, I can do this, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her mind flipped through everything she had ever learned, manuals, checklists, simulations. She remembered a training scenario where the pilot had lost consciousness mid-flight. She had completed the landing successfully in the simulator, but this was no simulation. The jet climbed steadily, engines humming with a reassuring power, yet beneath her calm exterior, panic clawed at Emma's chest. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her lungs tightening as the enormity of the situation pressed down on her. She knew that one wrong move, one hesitation, could mean catastrophe. She glanced again at Frank, his body limp over the controls. For a moment, a wave of despair threatened to engulf her, but then something inside her shifted. A flicker of determination sparked in her chest. I have to do this, she whispered. I have to save them. Emma moved quickly now, fingers finding the autopilot switch with a precision she didn't know she possessed. She adjusted the altitude, engaged the stabilizers, and felt the plane respond under her touch. A small victory, but it was fragile. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, pale blue and deceptive, hiding nothing yet suggesting everything. From the cabin, muffled cries and confusion began to filter up through the intercom. Emma could hear snippets of conversation. A child asking their mother why the plane was shaking, a man's voice rising in alarm. Panic had begun to ripple through the passengers, though they had no idea the scale of the emergency. Emma gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus. She repeated the checklist silently in her mind: autopilot, altitude, heading, throttle. Everything she did had to be perfect. Every second mattered. She could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical force. She was no longer just a teenager in a flight program. She was the person in control, the person in charge of survival. Then, just as she was beginning to feel a tentative sense of control, a loud thump reverberated through the fuselage. The plane jolted violently, and a warning light blinked red on the console. Something was wrong with one of the engines. Emma's stomach lurched, and her hands shook violently on the controls. Her voice, almost a whisper, trembled as she muttered to herself, No, I can't fail, not now." And in that instant, as the plane steadied slightly but still trembled under the invisible threat, Emma realized the full gravity of what lay ahead. She had climbed into the cockpit as a student, eager and wide-eyed. But now she was alone, completely and terrifyingly alone. The realization hit her like a punch. She was about to fly a commercial jet, fully loaded with 300 lives, with an unconscious captain beside her, an engine failing and no promise of outside help. And yet somewhere deep within her a spark of resolve ignited. She had trained for this. She had dreamed of this moment, and now there was no turning back. Emma tightened her grip on the controls, took a sharp, trembling breath and whispered, "Okay, let's fly." The cockpit felt impossibly small, and yet the weight of the world pressed down on Emma Lawson. Captain Frank Torres lay slumped over the controls, his breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. Emma stared at him, frozen for a heartbeat, then shook herself violently. She had watched emergency procedures countless times, but this was raw, chaotic, terrifyingly real. Her hands hovered over the yoke. The autopilot was engaged, but she knew it was temporary, a fragile lifeline, not a solution. One wrong input, one delayed decision, and the lives of 300 people were dangling in the balance. She could hear the faint murmur of passengers through the intercom. "What's happening? Is everything okay?" Their voices sounded ordinary, innocent, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. Emma's mind raced. She remembered every detail from her simulator sessions: checklists, throttle adjustments, flaps, autopilot settings. She had memorized the sequence of actions like a musician memorizes a difficult piece. But in a simulator, mistakes had consequences only on a screen. Here, one misstep could destroy lives. "Okay, I can do this," she whispered under her breath, gripping the yoke with white-knuckled determination. She leaned over the controls, peering at Frank, trying to see if his eyes would flutter open. Nothing. His body was lifeless, unmoving. The intercom crackled again. Derek's voice, tight with fear, broke through the tension. "Tower, we need immediate instructions. Captain Torres is unconscious. We don't know what to do." Emma realized she had to act fast. The autopilot was holding, but the plane was still climbing slightly above the designated altitude. She fumbled for the throttle, adjusting it to maintain level flight. The hum of the engines filled her ears, vibrating through her chest, a physical reminder of the immense force she now commanded. Outside, the sky stretched wide and indifferent. The city of Denver receded beneath them, its buildings tiny, its streets a grid of gray and green. Clouds drifted lazily, hiding nothing yet hinting at the unpredictable forces waiting above. Emma felt a jolt of vertigo, a sudden awareness of just how high she was and how fragile life seemed from this altitude. She reached for the radio, hands shaking. "Control, this is Flight 427. Captain is unresponsive. We need guidance." Her voice cracked, betraying the calm she tried to force. There was static, a pause, then the distant, procedural voice of air traffic control. "Flight 427, please repeat. Say your situation clearly." Emma swallowed hard. "Captain is unconscious. I am 17 years old and not a trained pilot. I need immediate instructions for maintaining control and preparing for landing. Engine systems are stable, autopilot engaged, but I need help." The silence that followed was deafening. She could hear her own heartbeat thumping in her ears, the persistent hum of the engines, and the subtle vibrations of the fuselage as the plane glided forward. Panic threatened to overtake her, but she forced herself to focus. Each breath had to be steady, each movement precise. Suddenly, a series of alarms rang out from the dashboard. Red lights blinked, and a low, urgent tone reverberated through the cockpit. Emma's stomach dropped. The autopilot had detected an anomaly in the hydraulic system controlling the rudder. The plane shuddered slightly, a reminder that the perfect calm was already fracturing. Emma's hands flew over the controls. Check hydraulics, throttle," she muttered, reciting the checklist she had drilled endlessly. Her fingers found the switches, toggling them carefully, hoping her memory didn't fail her at the crucial moment. Sparks of fear ignited in her chest, but she forced them down, focusing only on the tasks in front of her. Meanwhile, in the cabin, murmurs of confusion were growing into rising panic. A mother clutched her daughter tightly, whispering reassurances she could barely believe herself. A businessman pressed his forehead to the window, eyes wide with fear, silently counting the seconds. Cabin crew moved with urgent efficiency, trying to soothe the passengers, but even they could sense the tension, the subtle deviation of a flight gone awry. Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. She had studied every emergency scenario imaginable, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming responsibility of knowing that mistakes could cost lives in mere seconds. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a shaky breath, forcing herself to remember the training, the simulations, the calm focus she had been taught. Her mind raced through a mental checklist: altitude, heading, flaps, engine status, autopilot, rudder controls, landing gear, airspeed. She double-checked each parameter, adjusting gently, feeling the plane respond with minute shifts that told her she was managing just barely to keep the aircraft stable. Then through the crackling intercom, Derek's voice came again, sharper this time. Flight 427, we are detecting a deviation in your altitude. Please respond. Emma's throat tightened. I'm adjusting, I've got it under control, she shouted, more to herself than anyone else. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the yoke. Her eyes darted between instruments, reading warnings, gauges, blinking lights. Each warning was a small hammer striking her confidence, yet she had no choice but to act. The engines rumbled ominously. A subtle vibration ran through the fuselage, and Emma felt the first real tremor of fear. Lightning flashed faintly through clouds in the distance, illuminating the cockpit in stark, shifting light. She blinked rapidly, forcing her mind to stay on task. One misstep, one hesitation, and the delicate balance keeping this massive jet in the air would collapse. Emma's fingers found the intercom again. "Passengers, please remain calm," she said, voice shaking. "We are experiencing technical difficulties, but we are okay. Please stay in your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Her words sounded hollow even to her own ears, a fragile attempt to impose control over a situation that felt like chaos. From the corner of her eye, she saw Frank's still body and felt the cold dread of isolation wash over her. There was no one else to take over, no safety net beyond her own knowledge and determination. Suddenly, a subtle jolt shook the plane. Emma froze. Her mind raced through possible causes: turbulence, engine failure, mechanical malfunction. She glanced at the instrument panel. One of the engines was beginning to fluctuate, warning lights flickering. Her stomach lurched. She had minutes, maybe seconds, to stabilize it before disaster became inevitable. Emma gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus. "You've trained for this, Emma. You've prepared. You can do this." Her voice was barely audible, a mantra against the rising panic. She adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and felt the plane respond just enough to stay level. From somewhere deep in the cabin, a muffled scream echoed, a passenger sensing something was wrong. Emma's heart sank. She wasn't just managing a plane, she was managing fear, both hers and theirs, while the storm outside the cockpit threatened to compound every misstep. Her mind flicked back to simulations, to hours spent learning how to keep a plane airborne, how to correct errors, how to land under pressure. She hadn't just learned maneuvers, she had absorbed the philosophy of calm in chaos. Now, every second of that training mattered. Every memory, every calculated action would determine whether they survived. And then a new, horrifying thought struck her: the landing. She hadn't even begun to think about landing yet. The plane was stable barely, but the hardest part was still ahead. She had to bring it down safely with one engine fluctuating, an unconscious captain beside her, and a storm looming on the horizon. Emma's pulse raced, adrenaline surging. She inhaled deeply, trying to suppress the shaking in her hands. She looked at the autopilot, the throttle, the blinking lights, and whispered, almost to herself, "Just keep it steady, just keep it steady. Then we land." Her eyes darted to the altimeter, then to the radar, then back to Frank. The cockpit was a cage of tension, vibrating with the hum of engines, the weight of responsibility, and the invisible clock counting down to potential disaster. Emma's voice cracked as she spoke into the radio again. "Tower, please, we need instructions. I need help now." And then, before any response could come, a loud metallic thump echoed through the fuselage. The plane shuddered violently. Something had hit the engine, or maybe a control surface. Emma didn't know. She could feel the vibration in her teeth, in her chest, and she realized with a jolt of fear that the moment to act had arrived. Her heart thundered. Her hands were on the controls, her mind screaming. She was alone, completely alone, and the next move would determine the fate of every single person aboard. Emma Lawson's hands trembled, white-knuckled on the yoke, but she forced herself to breathe. The metallic thump that had shaken the plane moments ago still reverberated in her chest. She had no choice but to act, and acting meant relying on everything she had ever learned in simulators, textbooks, and flight school videos. Her mind raced, running through procedures, emergency protocols, and the countless what-ifs she had prepared for. But this was real. "Autopilot, stay steady," she muttered to herself. She tapped the panel, double-checking the throttle settings. The engines hummed unevenly, one vibrated more than the other, a subtle but alarming warning that it could fail entirely. Her stomach lurched at the thought. She could feel every passenger's life pressing down on her, an invisible weight crushing her chest, yet she forced herself to remain calm. Glancing at the unconscious figure of Captain Frank Torres, she felt the full gravity of her isolation. He was supposed to be the one in control, guiding her through turbulence, through emergencies, through disasters she had only ever imagined. But now he was gone. Emma realized that she had to be the pilot, not a student, not an observer, the pilot. She reached for the radio. "Control tower, Flight 427, Captain unresponsive, student pilot in control, request immediate emergency guidance," she said, her voice cracking but gaining firmness as she spoke. Static answered her. Then a calm, professional voice finally came through. "Flight 427, this is Denver approach. We copy your situation. Maintain current altitude, keep the autopilot engaged, and prepare for descent procedures. Do you have control of the yoke?" Emma's pulse raced. "Yes, I think so, but one engine is unstable. I don't know how long it will hold," she replied. "Understood," the voice responded calmly. "We will guide you through the descent. You are doing fine. Stay focused." Emma swallowed, relief washing over her briefly, but it was short-lived. The warnings on the dashboard continued to blink red. The plane shuddered slightly as if testing her resolve. She took a deep breath, remembering what Frank had once told her. "In flying, panic is your worst enemy. Calm is your friend." She forced herself to focus. She checked the flaps, the altitude, the heading. Everything was moving slightly off the ideal, but nothing was yet catastrophic. Carefully, she nudged the throttle to stabilize the engine output. The vibration diminished slightly, but it was a warning. She was operating on borrowed time. Outside the cockpit, the world was calm but deceptive. The city of Denver was far below, the mountains stretching in quiet majesty. Clouds gathered in the distance, dark and threatening, a prelude to the storm that could complicate everything. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the wings and engine housings like a harsh strobe light. Emma's fingers tightened on the controls. She had to keep it together. Every movement, every adjustment mattered. She glanced at the instrument panel, memorizing every warning light, every gauge. The altimeter, the speed indicator, the heading dial, they were all telling her something, something subtle but vital. The plane was still flying, still level, but only just. Emma's mind raced to the first major decision, how to begin descending safely while maintaining stability. She had read about controlled descent procedures, but she had never done one in real life. Her palms were slick with sweat, her hair sticking to her forehead, but she forced herself to move decisively. She toggled the autopilot to adjust the altitude gradually, then carefully monitored the vertical speed indicator. A sudden lurch reminded her that the plane wasn't entirely obedient. She pushed the yoke forward slightly, coaxing the nose down gently, trying not to overcorrect. The engines groaned in protest, but the plane complied. Her stomach twisted as she felt the first true responsibility of command settle on her shoulders. "Focus, focus, focus," she whispered, leaning closer to the panel. She repeated the steps she had memorized: throttle adjustments, flaps, altitude, autopilot settings, heading, rudder control. Her hands moved quickly but carefully, learning the feel of the controls in a way no simulator could replicate. Through the intercom, passengers began to murmur. Some noticed the turbulence, the subtle shuddering of the plane. Some glanced nervously at the flight attendants, whose faces were tight with professional composure. Emma could hear the faint sound of a baby crying, the muffled sobs of passengers gripping their armrests. The human element pressed on her just as much as the technical. She wasn't just piloting a machine, she was responsible for 300 lives. A new warning light flashed on the dashboard. The rudder hydraulic system was under strain. Panic surged, but Emma forced herself to take a deep breath. She remembered the manual, the diagrams she had studied countless times, the procedure for adjusting the stabilizers manually. It was complex, delicate, but she knew she could do it. She toggled the appropriate switches, nudged the yoke, and felt the plane respond, subtly but effectively. Her confidence grew slightly, but only just. The storm outside was approaching. Lightning arced across distant clouds, and turbulence began to rock the plane more violently. Emma gritted her teeth, fighting nausea and fear. Every motion, every input, every decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Suddenly, a jolt ran through the plane. The engine that had been sputtering now made a loud, unnatural clatter. Emma's heart pounded. She realized that the autopilot might not hold this time. She had to take manual control. Hands trembling, she disengaged the autopilot. The yoke felt heavier than before, every small movement amplified. She adjusted the throttle, coaxing the unstable engine, feeling the vibrations through her fingertips. The plane wavered slightly, but she held it steady. "Steady, steady, steady," she muttered, speaking as much to the plane as to herself. She could feel the tension in her body, the adrenaline surging through her veins. The weight of responsibility was nearly unbearable, but she forced herself to maintain focus. A flash of lightning illuminated the cockpit. Emma's eyes darted across the instruments, scanning for any indication that she had missed something. The engine seemed to stabilize for the moment. She exhaled slowly, a tiny relief, but she knew it was temporary. The intercom crackled again. Derek's voice, strained but calm, broke through. "Flight 427, the storm is approaching. Expect turbulence on descent. Keep her steady, Emma." Emma swallowed hard, nodding even though no one could see her. Yes, I understand. We're holding it steady." She felt a strange, surreal clarity wash over her. In the eye of this invisible storm, she was no longer just a student or a teenager. She was a pilot, commanding a plane in crisis, balancing hundreds of lives in her hands. Every detail mattered, every adjustment counted. She couldn't afford distraction, fear, or hesitation. Her mind flicked to landing. She hadn't even begun to consider the approach. The autopilot could stabilize, the engines could hum steadily, but eventually someone had to bring this massive jet down safely. And that someone was her. Emma's stomach twisted at the thought. She looked down at the instrument panel, then out the cockpit window at the storm looming closer, the dark clouds swirling, the lightning arcing. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the yoke again. She was about to face the impossible, descending, maneuvering, and landing a commercial jet, alone, at 17, with one unstable engine and an unconscious captain beside her. A distant roar of wind rattled the fuselage. Emma's pulse surged. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She whispered under her breath, almost a prayer, "I can do this, I have to do this." And then, a sudden, violent shudder ran through the plane. The engine that had seemed stable now sputtered again, throwing the plane slightly off balance. Emma's stomach lurched, her heart pounding. She was flying a live jet with an engine on the brink of failure, turbulence ahead, and the lives of hundreds depending entirely on her next move. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to act. Hands steadying, mind razor-sharp, Emma prepared for the next stage, the descent, the approach, and the impossible challenge of landing the plane. The real test was just beginning. Emma Lawson's hands shook as she gripped the yoke, sweat running down her temples, fingers slick against the cold metal. The sky outside the cockpit window had changed. What had begun as a deceptively calm morning had transformed into a roiling gray maelstrom. Clouds thickened, dark and threatening, their edges illuminated by distant flashes of lightning. The storm was approaching faster than Emma had anticipated, and the turbulence was no longer a subtle warning. It was a violent, unpredictable force trying to wrest control from her grasp. She adjusted the throttle, her knuckles white, and peered at the instruments. One engine was sputtering again, its warning light blinking insistently. The autopilot struggled to compensate, vibrating with tension as it attempted to maintain altitude. Emma forced herself to remain calm, forcing her mind to focus on the procedures she had memorized. But deep down, a gnawing realization spread through her chest. She had trained for simulated emergencies, not real ones. This was chaos with human lives at stake. The intercom crackled. Flight 427, you are now entering a severe weather zone. Expect turbulence and possible lightning strikes. Keep your seatbelts fastened, came the calm voice of the cabin crew. Emma's heart lurched. She knew the turbulence wasn't the worst of it. The storm could bring wind shear, sudden gusts strong enough to push the plane off course, and she was still miles from the airport. She forced her gaze back to the altimeter, the vertical speed indicator, and the engine gauges. Every reading demanded immediate attention. Every second counted. Her mind flicked to Captain Frank Torres. He had collapsed so suddenly, his breathing shallow, his body limp against the controls. Emma couldn't understand why. He had been perfectly healthy that morning, or at least she thought he had. A sudden illness, a heart attack, a stroke. The questions raced in her mind, but she had no time to dwell. Right now, the only priority was survival. Lightning flashed close, illuminating the cockpit in harsh, brilliant light. Emma flinched, but forced herself to maintain focus. She adjusted the rudder to counteract a sudden gust of wind that rocked the plane sideways. A low, ominous groan echoed from the engines. One sputtered again, a stutter in the hum that set Emma's teeth on edge. Her hands moved automatically, each action precise despite the fear clawing at her insides. She toggled switches, monitored the engines, adjusted the yoke, and slowly coaxed the plane back to stability. But she knew it was temporary. The storm was relentless, and her resources, her knowledge, her reflexes, her confidence, were being tested beyond anything she had imagined. A sudden jolt threw her slightly forward in her seat. Warning lights blinked furiously. The rudder hydraulic system was under strain, the autopilot groaning as it struggled to maintain the plane's heading. Emma's stomach twisted. This was more than turbulence. It was an invisible enemy, a combination of mechanical vulnerability and natural chaos threatening to undo all her careful adjustments. "Focus, Emma, focus," she whispered, trying to calm her racing heart. "You can do this. You know what to do." Her eyes darted to the instruments. The altimeter fluctuated. The vertical speed indicator quivered. The engine warning lights blinked like angry red eyes, demanding her attention. She toggled the switches controlling the rudder, praying she was stabilizing it correctly. The plane shuddered in response. A small victory, but a fleeting one. Through the intercom, muffled voices echoed. Passengers were beginning to panic. A child screamed. A mother clutched her son tightly, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. Cabin crew moved through the aisles, calm and professional, but even they were responding to the subtle cues of fear that spread through the cabin like wildfire. Emma realized, with a jolt of terror, that she wasn't just fighting the storm or the plane's failing systems. She was fighting time, fear, and the fragility of human life itself. Every decision, every adjustment mattered. One miscalculation could send the plane spiraling into disaster. She glanced at the clock. They were still miles from the airport, and the storm was accelerating. Rain pelted the windshield in a relentless barrage, reducing visibility to almost zero. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the wings, the engines, and the frazzled but determined face of a 17-year-old girl who had never flown alone in real life before today. Emma's mind raced. She had to think ahead. The landing approach would require precision, control, and nerves of steel, qualities she was unsure she possessed. But the plane would not wait for her confidence. The storm was merciless, mechanical systems were faltering, and the lives of 300 people depended entirely on her ability to adapt and survive. Suddenly, another jolt rocked the plane. The engine warning light blinked faster, a stuttering red signal that screamed danger. Emma's stomach lurched. She realized with chilling clarity that the engine might fail entirely at any second. Her fingers moved instinctively over the controls, compensating for the turbulence. She adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and felt the plane respond. But the vibrations persisted, subtle yet relentless. Her pulse raced. This was more than skill. It was endurance, courage, and raw determination. Stay calm, she whispered, leaning closer to the instrument panel. Her eyes darted between gauges, switches, and warning lights. She had to anticipate every possible failure, every potential gust of wind, every mechanical issue. She had to think faster than the storm, faster than the plane, faster than fear itself. A loud crack of thunder shook the fuselage, rattling her teeth. Emma's heart leapt into her throat. The plane shuddered violently, tilting slightly to the side. She yanked the yoke in the opposite direction, her body straining with the effort, feeling the immense force of the storm pushing against her every move. The rudder responded, slowly correcting the plane's course, but she knew it was barely enough. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to panic more openly. The cries of frightened children, the whispered prayers of adults, the hurried footsteps of crew members moving through narrow aisles, all of it filtered up into the cockpit. Emma realized the true magnitude of her responsibility. She wasn't just piloting a plane. She was holding 300 human lives in her hands, balancing their fear, their hope, and their survival with each delicate adjustment of the controls. She focused on breathing, slow and deliberate, forcing herself to stay in the present. Panic would ruin her. Hesitation would destroy them all. She repeated the emergency checklist in her mind, step by step, action by action, committing each motion to memory as she executed it with trembling hands. The storm intensified. Sheets of rain lashed against the windshield, obscuring the runway lights in the distance. Lightning illuminated the clouds, revealing the swirling, chaotic mass that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The invisible enemy, the storm, the failing engine, the mechanical stress, was everywhere, pressing down on Emma from all sides. A sudden sharp alarm screamed through the cockpit. The engine that had been sputtering was now faltering significantly. Emma's stomach lurched violently. She had to act. With every ounce of focus, she adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and held the plane steady. The autopilot groaned, fighting against the failing systems, but she maintained control, feeling the sweat drip down her spine. For a moment, a strange calm washed over her. Despite the chaos, despite the fear, she was flying. She was in control. She was alive. And yet she knew the storm was far from over. The invisible enemy was relentless, and the hardest part was yet to come. Emma took a deep breath, forcing her mind to the next step: descent. The airport was miles away, the storm was approaching faster, and the plane was showing signs of stress. She realized with cold clarity that she would soon have to bring the jet down, an impossible task for a 17-year-old student with an unconscious captain and a malfunctioning engine. She gritted her teeth. "I can do this, I have to do this," she whispered, eyes locked on the instruments, heart pounding, hands steady. The storm was coming, and she would meet it head-on. The cabin of Flight 427 had transformed from a space of ordinary travel into a chamber of controlled chaos. Passengers gripped their armrests, eyes wide with fear, murmurs swelling into audible panic. The hum of the engines had become a roar of uncertainty, punctuated by the occasional metallic groan as the plane struggled against the turbulence. Children cried, and mothers whispered urgent reassurances they barely believed themselves. Even the calm professionalism of the flight attendants was strained. Their forced smiles could not mask the tension that radiated through the cabin. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Emma Lawson's face was slick with sweat. Her hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, fingers moving in a precise choreography dictated by instinct and memory. The autopilot had been disengaged. She could not rely on it anymore, and the engines, one already faltering, were straining against the storm. Her stomach twisted, a mix of nausea and fear as she adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and coaxed the plane into stability. The plane lurched violently, forcing Emma to brace herself. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cockpit in stark, fleeting brilliance, revealing the sheer weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Captain Frank Torres remained slumped over the controls, unconscious, a silent reminder of the stakes. Emma's heart pounded. She was the only pilot in control, the only person capable of saving the hundreds of lives surrounding her. Through the intercom, passengers' panic grew. A young boy screamed, gripping his mother's arm with terrifying intensity. She whispered urgently, "It's going to be okay, honey. Just stay calm." But even her own voice betrayed uncertainty. Flight attendants moved swiftly down the aisles, but the cabin tremors from the storm and the faltering engine made every step precarious. Drinks spilled, bags shifted violently in overhead compartments, and the roar of the wind outside made the ordinary sounds of the cabin surreal, distorted. Emma's gaze snapped back to the instruments. Altitude was fluctuating slightly, speed indicators wavered. One engine was sputtering, warning lights blinking red like urgent signals of impending failure. The plane shuddered violently, forcing her to counteract with careful adjustments. She felt the weight of every soul on board pressing into her consciousness. There was no room for error, no margin for hesitation. A flash of lightning illuminated the cockpit and Emma's heart leapt. She realized with growing dread that the storm was worse than predicted. She could see the cloud banks swirling violently outside, a turbulent maelstrom threatening to throw the plane off course at any moment. Gusts of wind rocked the jet, and Emma adjusted the yoke with all her strength, feeling the resistance in her fingers. She whispered to herself, "Focus, breathe, control." The intercom crackled again. Derek's voice, tight with tension, filtered through the static. Flight 427, altitude dropping slightly. Visibility deteriorating. Prepare for potential emergency approach. Emma nodded, though he could not see her. Understood, maintaining stability, preparing for descent. Her voice was steadier than she felt, a fragile veneer over the torrent of fear and adrenaline surging through her veins. She adjusted the throttles again, balancing the strain of one unstable engine, coaxing the rudder to compensate for wind gusts, praying the adjustments would hold. The turbulence worsened. The plane pitched suddenly, throwing objects from the overhead compartments, shaking passengers violently in their seats. Gasps and screams filled the cabin. Emma's stomach lurched, a visceral reaction to the chaos she could feel through the yoke, yet she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would be fatal. Focus was her only weapon. She took a deep breath and surveyed the dashboard. One engine was now intermittently losing power, the rudder system still under strain, and the instruments indicated that the plane's balance was precarious. Emma's mind raced, calculating, anticipating, adjusting. She was no longer thinking about simulations. She was thinking about survival, about every second, every inch of altitude, every adjustment necessary to keep the aircraft from becoming a death trap. Through the intercom, passengers' voices continued to rise in panic. A mother whispered prayers over her child, a businessman clenched the armrest, teeth gritted in silent terror. Emma knew that they were counting on her, even if they did not know it. Their lives, their fear, and their hope were now inextricably linked to her actions. Emma's focus shifted to the descent. She had stabilized the plane for the moment, but the storm's velocity and the failing engine meant that she could not linger at cruising altitude for long. She had to begin a controlled descent toward Denver International Airport, but the turbulence, the wind shear, and the malfunctioning engine made even that step perilous. Her eyes darted to the instruments, memorizing every detail, every fluctuation. She adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and carefully guided the plane downward. The storm's intensity grew, wind gusts throwing the plane off course, forcing Emma to counteract continuously. Her muscles burned from the effort, her hands cramped, but she could not afford to falter. Lightning struck closer this time, the sudden flash illuminating the plane in harsh, white brilliance. Emma could see the wings flexing, the engine straining, the horizon almost completely obscured by clouds. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain steady. The descent was critical, too steep and the plane could nosedive, too shallow and she risked running out of runway. Every calculation mattered. Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the fuselage. Objects in the cabin rattled violently. Emma felt her stomach lurch as she realized one engine had just failed completely. Her pulse spiked, adrenaline flooding her veins. She was now flying a plane on one functional engine, through a storm, toward a landing she had never performed in real life. The cabin erupted in noise. Passengers screamed, prayed, and held on for dear life. Flight attendants moved frantically, trying to maintain order. Emma gritted her teeth, forcing herself to ignore the chaos behind her. She could not attend to panic. She had to focus on survival. She glanced at Captain Torres, still unconscious, and felt the full weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was no longer a student in a cockpit. She was the pilot. Every decision, every movement, every second mattered. Emma's voice, steady but urgent, crackled through the intercom. "Passengers, please remain calm. We are experiencing technical difficulties, but we are under control. Remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened. Crew, please prepare for turbulence and possible emergency landing." Her words were thin comfort, but they were all she had. She adjusted the yoke again, balancing the plane, coaxing it through the storm, navigating the invisible currents of wind and fear that pressed from every direction. She felt the plane respond beneath her fingers, a delicate dance of human skill against natural chaos. The airport came into view, distant and partially obscured by clouds. The runway lights glimmered faintly like fragile beacons through the storm. Emma's chest tightened. The descent was underway, but the final approach would be treacherous. The plane was battered, the storm relentless, and she had only one functioning engine. She swallowed, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Okay, next step, landing." Her hands tightened on the yoke, muscles burning from exertion, mind laser-focused on the horizon, on the runway, on the delicate balance of speed, altitude, and control. She was flying a plane alone in an emergency situation most adults would never survive, and she had no choice but to succeed. The storm raged, the passengers trembled, and the plane shuddered violently once more. Emma Lawson, 17 years old, was about to attempt the most impossible maneuver of her life, a controlled landing through chaos, fear, and mechanical failure. The rain pounded against the cockpit windows in a relentless torrent, the plane shuddering under the force of wind gusts. Emma Lawson's arms burned, muscles trembling from the constant adjustments she had made over the past tense hours. The autopilot was off. One engine had already failed completely, and the other groaned under the stress of compensating for turbulence and wind shear. Every second felt like an eternity, every movement a matter of life and death. The lights of Denver International Airport flickered through the sheets of rain, faint and elusive. They were her only anchor, the only sign that the ground awaited. But the storm obscured everything else. Clouds churned violently around the fuselage, and lightning illuminated the cockpit in intermittent, brilliant flashes, revealing her own pale, sweat-drenched face, eyes wide with determination and fear. Emma's stomach twisted as she realized the truth. The plane was fragile, the storm merciless, and the lives of 300 people depended entirely on her ability to bring Flight 427 safely to the runway. She gritted her teeth and adjusted the yoke slightly, compensating for a sudden gust that tilted the jet dangerously. The plane groaned under the stress, the wings flexing, the fuselage trembling, and she felt every vibration through her arms and chest. "Focus, every second, every move," she muttered, voice tight. She toggled the throttle carefully, coaxing the remaining engine to produce steady power. Her eyes flicked to the instruments, altitude, airspeed, heading, memorized indicators that now held the key to survival. From the cabin, the panic had escalated. Children whimpered softly, clinging to their parents, whose own faces were pale with fear. Flight attendants moved as efficiently as possible, but even their calm voices could not mask the tension that radiated through the air. Emma could hear the faint rattle of luggage in overhead bins, the shuffling of feet, the collective anxiety of hundreds of souls. Each sound pressed into her mind, reminding her of the stakes she faced. Lightning cracked dangerously close, illuminating the wingtip in a blinding flash. Emma flinched but immediately refocused on the instruments. She had practiced simulated landings countless times, but never like this. Never with one engine dead, storm winds lashing the plane, visibility near zero, and an entire cabin of terrified passengers counting on her. She reached for the radio. "Denver Tower, Flight 427, we are beginning approach. Request guidance for emergency landing. One engine failure, student pilot in control." A calm, professional voice crackled back. "Flight 427, we have you on radar. Maintain your current heading. Winds are strong. Adjust approach angle to compensate for crosswinds. You are cleared for emergency landing on runway 27L. Guidance will be provided step by step. Stay steady." Emma nodded, even though no one could see her. She repeated the instructions under her breath: approach angle, crosswind compensation, runway alignment. Her palms were slick with sweat, fingers trembling, but her focus sharpened. Every instruction from the tower was a lifeline. Every adjustment could mean survival. The storm intensified. Gusts of wind slammed into the fuselage, tilting the plane violently to one side, then the other. Rain battered the windshield in blinding sheets, each droplet a tiny hammer against the glass. Emma fought to maintain control, adjusting the yoke, nudging the throttle, and keeping the remaining engine balanced. The plane shuddered but did not fall. Not yet. Her mind flicked to Captain Frank Torres, slumped unconscious beside her. She realized with a pang of fear that he might never wake. She had no backup, no safety net, only her own knowledge, instincts, and courage. For the first time in her life, Emma felt the raw weight of true responsibility. Every choice she made would determine whether 300 lives would end in disaster or salvation. The runway lights grew slightly brighter, blurred through the rain and turbulence. Emma adjusted the descent rate, coaxing the plane down gradually, fighting the wind gusts and the rocking of the fuselage. One wrong move, and the jet could skip across the tarmac or lose control entirely. "Steady, steady," she whispered, repeating it like a mantra. She had to keep the plane balanced, aligned, and descending at exactly the right speed. One slight miscalculation, one hesitation, and the lives of the passengers and her own would be in jeopardy. The engine groaned ominously, warning lights flickering. Emma's pulse spiked. She knew it might fail entirely before touchdown. She adjusted the throttle carefully, coaxing it to maintain power, willing it to hold just a few more minutes. The cabin continued to shudder with turbulence. Passengers gripped their armrests, praying silently, holding children tightly, eyes wide with terror. Emma could feel their collective fear pressing into her mind, a tangible force that threatened to overwhelm her focus. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to ignore it, to concentrate only on the instruments, the yoke, and the remaining engine. Lightning flashed again, blindingly bright. The plane tilted sharply, a sudden gust threatening to push it off course. Emma reacted instantly, nudging the yoke, adjusting the rudder, and coaxing the fuselage back into alignment. The plane groaned, vibrating under the strain, but it held. Through the intercom, she spoke again, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Passengers, please remain calm. We are approaching the runway. Crew, prepare for emergency landing procedures. Everything is under control." Her words were a fragile comfort. She could feel the tension in the cabin, the uncertainty in the passengers' eyes, the trembling in their hands. Every second brought them closer to the runway, closer to the moment when her skill, courage, and determination would be tested like never before. The plane shuddered again. The turbulence was at its peak, gusts threatening to tilt it sideways, the wing flexing violently. Emma adjusted instinctively, holding the yoke with all her strength, muscles screaming in protest. She had never felt anything like this before, the raw, unrelenting force of nature combined with the fragile mechanics of a machine and the immense responsibility of human lives. Her eyes flicked between the runway lights and the instruments. The alignment was slightly off. The crosswinds were stronger than predicted. She adjusted the approach angle, nudging the plane gently but decisively. Every minor correction mattered. Every second was critical. The engine groaned again, warning lights flickering. Emma's stomach dropped. She could feel the vibrations running through the controls. One engine, her only functioning engine, was under immense strain. She had to coax it, manage it, and hope it would hold for the final descent. The runway lights grew brighter. The plane descended slowly, dangerously, each foot closer to the ground, a step toward salvation or disaster. Emma's focus was absolute. No distractions, no hesitation, only precision, courage, and instinct. A sudden violent gust threw the plane sideways. Emma reacted instantly, nudging the yoke, adjusting the throttle, aligning the jet with the runway. The fuselage groaned and the cockpit rattled violently. She could feel the wind pushing against every surface, testing her skill, her nerves, and her willpower. Through the intercom, she spoke again, voice calm but firm. "Passengers, we are moments from landing. Please remain seated, keep seatbelts fastened, and trust in the crew. We are almost there." The runway stretched out ahead, rain slicked and shimmering in the storm. Emma adjusted the descent rate, coaxing the plane toward the runway, compensating for the crosswinds and turbulence. She could feel the plane responding, each movement precise but delicate, a balance of skill and courage. The final approach had begun. The storm raged, the wind battered the fuselage, the engine strained, and the plane groaned under the immense stress. Emma Lawson, 17 years old, student pilot, was moments away from the most impossible landing of her life. The runway stretched ahead, a fragile ribbon of light barely visible through the rain and turbulence. Emma Lawson's hands ached from gripping the yoke, muscles trembling, but she did not release her hold. Her eyes darted between instruments and the storm-battered horizon, calculating every adjustment. The plane shuddered violently as a sudden gust of wind slammed against the fuselage, pushing it sideways. She nudged the yoke, correcting the tilt, heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. The passengers were tense, every muffled sob, every whispered prayer echoing through the cabin and pressing against her focus. Emma realized they were counting on her, even if they did not know it. She had to succeed. There was no other option. She adjusted the throttle, coaxing the remaining engine to deliver maximum, stable power. The engine groaned, protesting under the stress, but it held for now. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the wings in brilliant white, highlighting the immense challenge before her. The plane shuddered again as the storm's full fury struck, rain lashing against the fuselage and obscuring visibility almost completely. Emma's pulse spiked. She had trained for simulated landings, for turbulence, for emergencies, but never like this. This was raw, unforgiving reality. Her mind was razor-sharp. Each movement had to be precise. The descent rate, the throttle, the yoke adjustments, rudder control, crosswind compensation. The plane groaned and tilted, the wing flexing under the strain. Emma fought to maintain balance, to keep the jet aligned with the runway, to control the beast she had never imagined flying alone. She heard a muffled scream from the cabin, a child, frightened, and swallowed her own fear. Every passenger's life was tethered to her skill, her courage, and her composure. Emma repeated the mantra she had whispered for hours: focus, breathe, control. The plane shuddered violently again. The wind shear slammed against them, the fuselage twisting. The single functioning engine groaned in protest. Emma adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and felt the jet respond. Just enough. She could feel the delicate balance of airspeed, altitude, and angle of descent teetering on the edge of disaster. Almost there, she whispered under her breath. Each second felt like a lifetime, each decision critical. She lowered the landing gear, hearing the hydraulic system strain under the storm's assault. The plane lurched slightly as the wheels deployed, a sharp reminder of how precarious everything was. Through the intercom she spoke, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Passengers, we are moments from landing. Remain calm, stay in your seats, and keep seatbelts fastened. Crew, prepare for emergency procedures." The storm raged. Wind gusts pushed the plane sideways, threatening to derail everything. Emma counteracted with precise rudder adjustments, carefully nudging the yoke, coaxing the aircraft toward the runway. The rain blurred her vision, lightning flashed unpredictably, and the jet shuddered under the strain. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she could not falter. She could see the runway lights flickering closer, barely visible through the sheets of rain. The final approach was underway. She adjusted the flaps, compensating for the wind, calculating descent angles. The plane dipped dangerously, then corrected. Each correction was a battle against nature and the failing mechanical systems, a fight between life and death. Her mind raced. She had to account for wind speed, engine limitations, the angle of approach, turbulence, and runway alignment, all while coaxing a massive jet with one working engine and one dead engine to safety. She swallowed the rising panic and focused on the instruments, the runway, and the subtle vibrations of the plane beneath her hands. The plane shuddered violently again. Lightning cracked dangerously close. Emma adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and felt the plane respond. She fought every moment to keep it level, balanced, and aligned. The runway lights glimmered faintly through the storm, a fragile promise of salvation in the chaos. The plane dipped lower. The wind slammed it sideways, tilting it dangerously. Emma countered with all her strength, her knuckles white, muscles straining. The single engine strained, groaning under the load, but it held. She could feel every vibration, every shift, every subtle movement of the plane as if it were an extension of her own body. She remembered the lessons Frank had taught her. In moments like this, trust the plane, trust your instincts, trust yourself. Emma forced herself to trust the training, trust the knowledge, trust the hands that had guided her this far. The runway was almost beneath them. Rain lashed against the fuselage, wind gusts threatened to push them off course, and the single engine groaned. Emma adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and aligned the plane for touchdown. Every second was a battle, every adjustment critical. The landing gear hit the tarmac with a violent jolt, the tires screeching against the wet runway. The plane bounced slightly, tilting under the crosswinds. Emma fought to maintain control, using rudder adjustments and throttle management to keep the jet stable. She could feel the strain of the storm pressing against her, the plane groaning under the effort. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the runway and the trembling jet. Emma's heart pounded as she applied brakes and reverse thrust, coaxing the plane to slow without losing control. The wet tarmac made every motion delicate. The crosswinds threatened to push the aircraft sideways, but she held firm, muscles screaming, mind focused, heart racing. Finally, the plane slowed, tires gripping the runway as Emma carefully guided it to a complete stop. She exhaled slowly, relief washing over her in waves. She had done it, against impossible odds, through chaos, through fear, through the storm. Flight 427 was on the ground. The cabin erupted in cries of relief and applause. Passengers hugged each other, some weeping openly. Flight attendants moved quickly to secure the cabin, checking on every passenger, ensuring everyone was safe. Emma's hands still gripped the yoke, trembling, sweat running down her face. She turned to glance at Frank Torres. He was still unconscious, but she had kept them alive. Tears blurred her vision as she realized the magnitude of what she had accomplished. She had flown a plane, alone, through a storm, with a failing engine, an unconscious captain, and hundreds of lives at stake, and she had succeeded. Yet even as relief washed over her, the reality of what had just occurred settled in. Emma Lawson, 17, had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. But the storm outside still raged, a reminder of the fragility of life and the immense courage it took to survive. The storm had begun to abate, leaving a wet, gray world in its wake. Rain dripped from the wings of Flight 427 as emergency crews swarmed the tarmac. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, their sirens muted beneath the exhausted cheers of passengers who had just survived the impossible. Emma Lawson, still gripping the yoke, felt the tremors of adrenaline finally ebb, leaving a profound exhaustion and a surreal sense of disbelief. Around her the cabin erupted. Passengers stood, some shaking, some sobbing, some embracing strangers who had survived beside them. Children clung to parents, wide-eyed and trembling. Flight attendants moved quickly, guiding passengers to remain calm, though their own faces betrayed the awe and relief they felt. Emma's heart swelled with the magnitude of what she had done, yet the surreal nature of it all kept her frozen for a moment longer. A tall emergency responder appeared at the cockpit door. "Miss Lawson, are you okay?" he asked, voice steady but urgent. Emma nodded slowly, finally releasing the yoke. Her arms burned, her hands were raw from gripping the controls, and her body ached from the strain of hours spent fighting wind, turbulence, and fear. She looked over at Captain Torres, still unconscious in his seat. She swallowed hard, relief and worry warring in her chest. She had landed the plane, but the man who had once been the authority in the cockpit was still in peril. The responder guided her out of the cockpit. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the lights of emergency vehicles reflecting off the wet tarmac. She felt the eyes of the passengers on her as she stepped into the cabin, and for a moment, the weight of everything she had accomplished hit her all at once. 300 lives had been saved by a 17-year-old girl who had been a student pilot, not a professional, not a trained captain. Passengers swarmed around her, offering trembling hands, hugs, and whispered thanks. Some cried openly. Some laughed nervously, trying to process the sudden transition from terror to survival. One elderly man, tears streaming down his face, grasped her hand and whispered, "You saved us all, my grandchildren, you saved us all." Emma's lips trembled. She had trained for emergencies, studied procedures, and practiced simulations, but nothing could have prepared her for this human response, for the weight of gratitude and relief that pressed into her chest. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away, focusing instead on the next steps. Captain Torres needed help. The passengers needed reassurance, and the world outside was about to learn what had happened. Emergency medical teams reached Captain Torres first. They carefully lifted him from the cockpit, checking vitals, administering oxygen, and preparing him for transport to the hospital. Emma watched, stomach tight, as the man who had trained her and inspired her lay in the arms of paramedics, unconscious but alive. She had kept them both alive, and the enormity of that realization brought a strange, overwhelming relief. Meanwhile, the passengers were being guided out of the aircraft. Each one passed Emma, pausing to offer thanks, tears in their eyes, expressions etched with disbelief and awe. She forced a smile, but her mind was still racing. She had survived, yes, but the reality of what she had done and what others would soon know was only beginning to sink in. News helicopters arrived over the airport. Reporters swarmed the tarmac, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. The story of a 17-year-old student landing a commercial jet with an unconscious captain and one failing engine was already spreading faster than any storm ever could. Emma felt the weight of scrutiny press against her, but she straightened, focusing on breathing and remaining composed. A journalist approached, notebook in hand, eyes wide with curiosity. "Miss Lawson, how did you do it? How did a teenager land a plane safely in such a storm?" Emma took a deep breath. Her voice was steady, calm, but underlaid with exhaustion and humility. I did what I had to do. I focused on the instruments, the procedures I've learned, and I kept everyone on board in mind. That's all I could do. I just did my best." The journalist scribbled furiously, but Emma's gaze drifted past him to the tarmac, to the passengers emerging, to the emergency crews working tirelessly, to Captain Torres being stabilized. In that moment, she realized that heroism wasn't just about the dramatic action in the cockpit. It was about courage under pressure, perseverance in the face of fear, and responsibility for lives that were not your own. The airport authorities coordinated with emergency services, ensuring all passengers were accounted for. Families were reunited, children hugged parents tightly, and friends embraced with relief that defied language. Emma watched it all, feeling a strange mixture of awe, exhaustion, and pride. She had survived the impossible, and so had they. Later, as the storm clouds began to part and the first rays of sunlight broke through, Emma was escorted to a small press area. Helicopters hovered in the sky, reporters crowded the space, and the world waited to hear the story. She stood on the wet tarmac, drenched from the rain, hair plastered to her forehead, eyes wide but bright with determination. A senior airport official approached. "Emma, the bravery and skill you've shown today are extraordinary. You've saved 300 lives. The world needs to know what you've done." Emma nodded slowly. Words failed her for a moment. The enormity of the situation, the intense focus required, the fear, the adrenaline, the lives in her hands, it all pressed down like a tidal wave. But she spoke, steady now, with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. I just did what I had to. I couldn't let anyone get hurt. That was my only choice," she said, voice firm. "I'm just glad everyone's okay." The press erupted in questions, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward. Emma answered each carefully, calmly, never embellishing, never exaggerating. She had performed the impossible, and yet her humility made the courage shine even brighter. As the hours passed, the story spread across news channels, social media, and international headlines. Teen saves 300 lives. Student pilot lands jet in storm. 17-year-old hero of Flight 427. The words traveled faster than the storm had, carrying Emma Lawson's courage into living rooms and classrooms across the country. Her school principal called. Her parents arrived in a blur of tears and disbelief, and reporters crowded for interviews. But Emma felt something deeper than fame or recognition, a quiet, overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had faced the unimaginable and emerged not just alive, but having saved hundreds of lives. That evening, as the storm fully passed and the sky cleared to reveal a breathtaking sunset, Emma sat quietly on a bench near the tarmac. She watched emergency crews finish their work, passengers leaving with their families, and the wrecked calm of the plane she had landed with her own hands. Her body ached, her mind raced, but her heart was full. Somewhere inside, she knew her life would never be the same. The story of Flight 427 would follow her forever, a testament to courage, skill, and determination beyond her years. But in that moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to feel the gravity of what she had done and the lives she had saved. She thought of Captain Torres, unconscious but alive, and the passengers who would never forget the terror and relief of the storm. She thought of the storm itself, a merciless adversary that had tested her, challenged her, and forced her to become something greater than she had ever imagined. And as the sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet tarmac in brilliant gold, Emma Lawson smiled softly, tears in her eyes, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. Courage does not come from age or experience. It comes from the willingness to face the impossible when lives depend on you.